Hello, everyone. So today we're going to do some review and then we're going to focus on the research writing process. So this is what I would call the most important video this semester. If there's one skill I need you to get all semester, it's this. Um, this is basically the difference between writing a high school report and a college research paper is the skill we're going to go over today. So I would recommend having this video handy and perhaps rewatching parts of it as is needed. You'll hear some repetition of this in the coming videos to make sure you have the skill down. So first, some quick review and a couple added notes. So don't forget, you need to be researching both your country and the United States on your topic. And you need about 8 to 10 facts on each side. That should allow you to do a 5-page paper plus a works cited. Also, this part of our paper assignment is what we're going to be going over today. The essay should not be a high school style report. We'll discuss the difference between high school reports and college research papers, and a large portion of the grade will be on fulfilling the requirements of a college level research paper, mainly using analysis, evaluation, reaching conclusions while avoiding plagiarism. Okay, so in high school, you do what are called reports, and that's you take in a lot of information and then basically you relay that back to a teacher. And 80 to 90% of what you relay back is what you found from your sources. In a college research paper, you need to analyze that information, evaluate, and then come to some conclusions and create a strong declarative thesis based on it. Okay, we'll look at what that looks like today in a few after our review. Don't forget, avoid historical topics, stay within the last 10 years, and assume that your reader knows the historical background. Then another thing that we'll be covering today, so last time we looked at MLA citation, one thing I want you to do is avoid long or block quotations. Because our papers are going to be short, at some point this semester I'll show you what they do look like in case you have to do a longer paper. But because we'll are doing a short paper, I don't want long or block quotations. So quotations should be no more than 2 to 3 lines of text. If the quotation is longer than that, then paraphrase or summarize and still cite the source. Okay. As a last resort, if you absolutely need to do a little bit longer quotation, then make sure your paper extends in length as well. Okay. Now we'll be talking about this today as we're going to go over the writing process or paragraph format for your paper. And so paragraph should be about 1/2 of a double space page. If it's longer, separate into 2. If it's shorter, you'll need to extend. It usually means you're not doing the process we're going over today. Okay, and don't forget, easiest route is to do 7 academic journals or more for your final paper. The minimum is 5, but the other trustworthy sources, if you were to use them, you have to evaluate them for trustworthiness. 75% of your paper needs to be based on academic journals. Okay, so between that and what we're going over today, that's where the focus of your grade will be. Don't forget, seek help, start early. Whenever possible, turn in your drafts early because I grade them in the order I receive them. So if you turn them in a day or 2 early, you might get them back really quickly. If you turn them in at the deadline, you might get them back much more slowly. Don't over research, as I said before, right? And be flexible. If you're having too many difficulties, check in with me and then slightly change your subject. Once you get into the drafting stage, that's going to be harder. So make sure you're able to find enough information now. Don't forget, you're supposed to narrow your topic as you research. So you're supposed to go from a broader subject down to something specific, like art education on the secondary level in the US and Japan. Make sure the topics you're comparing are reasonable. Remember the Thai military example. Instead of comparing the US military to the Thai military, which wouldn't be reasonable, you could change it to what could each military learn from each other, and that would be a more reasonable paper. Okay, don't forget, as you're developing your thesis, we'll talk about this more in the next video. We're going to focus on introductions and the thesis in the next video. So if you do need that, you could go ahead to that video and check it out. But in the meantime, think what is important or significant or interesting in the similarities and differences on my list. After doing research, come up with an assertive, declarative sentence. So not I think, not I believe, not in my opinion, just state it. The United States needs to adopt policies, etc. Okay. We'll talk about that more in the next video. Page 8 is evaluating trustworthiness, with the most important being evaluate professional affiliation. We've gone over that enough, I think. Last time we talked about using these type of questions to develop your thesis, that can be helpful. And at this point, you should start, you should try to aim to have a tentative thesis by now. Okay, you may change it as you write, but in order to start the writing process that we're going over today, you need to have at least a tentative thesis. Okay. Here's more about the thesis that we went over last time, with the qualities of a strong thesis statement at the bottom, and examples of how a research question or tentative thesis can lead to a final thesis. Okay, now I want to skip ahead here for a moment. Last time we went over MLA in-text citation rules. Remember, last name and page number is the most common that you should use. And also remember the rule that a quote from your source can never stand alone. It always needs a little phrase or clause from you leading into the quote or information from your source. Okay, so same here. You see the quote. You need some clause or phrase from you leading into that quote. Okay, and your in-text citation rules are all on this page, number 17, so I would have this handy. How to do multiple authors, no author, etc. Then on 18 is the Purdue OWL handout. Again, this tells you how that website works. Always have that on handy, and I would bookmark it, because anytime in your college career you're going to need to use citation, I would go to Purdue OWL immediately. They have everything you would need right there. Okay, and so let's dig into what we're talking about today. As I said, this is the most important topic all semester. Students who struggle in this course often do one of two things. Either they're not willing to put the time and work in to either the research or this process. And those are students who usually have struggled getting into college or are struggling with college now. And if you're not doing that type of work, it's going to be hard to help you, though. Come to me. I'm willing to do anything I can to help you. The other kind of student who struggles is a student who says, I've always got easy A's in all my English classes. It's just come easy to me. I'm a good writer. I can naturally do this stuff. So I'm going to wait till the last minute and do it. And what's the worst that can happen? A B, right? Unfortunately, those students struggle in this class a lot as well. Now, some will struggle with the first paper, and then they'll get on board for the second paper, which is one reason I make this first paper worth less than the second paper, but it's still worth a significant portion of your grade. So you need to spend the time learning these concepts. Okay. And so the biggest thing when in a beginning research course is it's pretty formulaic. We want you to write in a certain way. Now, as you get beyond an introduction course and are into your major and writing long research papers, you could vary a little from this format, right? But you need to learn the format first and master it, and then you can make some adjustments on it in future classes, okay? So first, a couple of definitions. So when I use the word evidence, it's going to be the data or individual fact on which to base a proof or establish a truth or falsehood. This is usually a quotation, paraphrase, or statistic from a trustworthy source. So think of it as if you're in a court case. You're trying to prove somebody is guilty, right? Say John Smith killed his wife Mary, and we need to prove him guilty. So the first thing we need to do is gather evidence. And in your papers, there'll be the quotation, the paraphrase, or statistic, or similar. And think, if all you have in your court case against John is one piece of evidence, he's probably going to go free, right? Depending on how damning that evidence is. But if you have 10, 15, 20 pieces of evidence, that makes your case more powerful. So the more evidence you can use in your paper and then present it to the audience, the more likely you are to write an effective paper. Although if you do too much evidence, then it becomes a high school report where you're just taking in information and regurgitating it back to your teacher. And that's not what you're supposed to do at the college level. Okay. Now we're going to look at analysis. Analysis is the separation of an intellectual or material whole into its parts for individual study. So if I was analyzing a car, I might take it apart or look at all those parts to analyze how it works, right? And then think of it, if I'm a mechanic who took apart a car and I want to do analysis of it, and say I'm trying to teach somebody who knows nothing about cars, I'm going to explain each one of those parts, right? So in your paper, you're going to analyze evidence. You're going to take a piece of evidence that you find, and you're going to break it down for your reader. Pretend your reader hasn't read the sources you have. So you need to explain those parts to your reader. The way I like it to think of analysis is breaking it down and asking questions like, what does it mean and why is it important? Okay, so you find a fact in a journal article, you present it in your paragraph that we're going to look at in a moment, and you need to explain to your reader why that's important. Or you could think of it in that court case again. You have a bloody knife. If you just throw it on the floor and leave the room, you're probably not going to convict John, right? But if you take that bloody knife and you explain that the blood has his DNA on it, and this is important because, and you explain it to the jury and put it in context, that jury is much more likely to convict. So think every piece of evidence you put in your paper, every single thing from a source, you need to explain to your reader what it means and why it's important. Okay, or use analysis. The other thing we're going to look at in your paragraphs is evaluation. Now, its term is just to examine carefully, but when we evaluate something, we normally look at the bigger picture. How does it connect to the larger idea of this paper, the thesis, or the general subject of this paper? Okay, so if I was to evaluate you for the semester, I'd holistically look at all your grades and think of your participation in the course and my interactions with you, and I would evaluate you through that lens, right? Maybe give you a grade or something similar. In the court case, it's taking this knife and telling its bigger story. Well, it was found at the murder scene. it has John's DNA and fingerprints on it. This is important because in explaining that bigger idea of the knife, how it connects to the murder, right? So in every paragraph, you need evidence, well, or I should say with the exception of your introduction and conclusion, although I find it is really useful to add evidence in your introduction. We'll look at that in the next video. But in every other paragraph of your paper, you need evidence, you need analysis, and you need evaluation. Okay? And this is that skill that if you master, if you're doing the research well and you master this skill, you're going to do well in this course. Okay. And it is a skill. I have students who say, oh, I've never written a research paper. This is so hard, right? And then after they get a few paragraphs and they get some feedback from me, they say, oh, this isn't so hard. They may still not like it, right? Because it is kind of like a formula. But they at least understand, and it gets easier the more you do it. Okay, so you get to your second paragraph of your paper. We'll talk more about your first paragraph next time. And every body paragraph of your paper should have this formula. Now, I have it listed 1 to 5, but it doesn't mean each one is a sentence. Okay, 1 to 5 here could be 1 to 2 sentences each. In a rare circumstance, it could be 3 sentences, but that is more the exception than the rule. Okay, so first, in 1 or 2 sentences, introduce the idea being discussed. What's the general idea that's going to be discussed in this paragraph? It needs to be general and not a cited fact. Right? So instead of say I'm writing on hip hop in Japan and saying there were 2,472 hip hop albums in Japan last year. That could not work because it needs to be cited. It's just a fact from one of your sources. If I made it more general, and this isn't perfect, this is just off the top of my head, but made it more general and said hip-hop music is very influential in the Japanese music scene, right? That is a general statement that doesn't need to be cited. So start your paragraph not with a fact that needs to be cited from your source. Instead, start it with a general statement about the topic that's going to be discussed in that paragraph. It could be 1 to 2 sentences. Next, introduce your evidence, right? So a quote, a paraphrase, or a statistic. Make sure you're using adding that intro clause or phrase, right? So was it this way? No. Don't forget, on every quote, you must add a clause or phrase before it, and then use citation after it. Okay? So make sure you're doing that. Okay. So add your evidence with an intro clause, a little phrase from you, and the citation at the end. Okay. And again, that can be 1 to 2 sentences. In very rare circumstances, it can be 3. But in those cases, you'll see a couple of them in the examples I give. But in those cases, what happens is often if you put 3 pieces of evidence in one paragraph, you're not able to fully analyze or evaluate them. So most often when I see students use 3 evidence sentences, usually they lose some points on that paragraph because they can't fully analyze or evaluate that information. Okay, so you've done your introduction, you've done your evidence. Okay, then you need to analyze your evidence. Break it down. What's it mean? Why is it important? Okay, we're going to look at some examples of that in a moment. Then we need, again, in 1 or 2 sentences. Then we need to evaluate that evidence. How does it connect to the larger idea or subject? And then the final step in every single paragraph should be connect it back to the thesis. Okay, so we have introduction, a general statement that doesn't need to be cited, your evidence with a clause or phrase before it and a citation after, analyzing it, break it down, what's it mean, why is it important, evaluate it, how does it connect to the larger idea or the thesis, and then 5, connect back to the thesis. That's called maintaining the thesis. Each one of those steps should normally be 1 to 2 sentences, in a rare exception, a third. And every paragraph throughout your paper should follow that format. That will be the primary thing I'll be evaluating from a writing stance. Okay, so how do you go about analyzing and evaluating information in your paper? Okay, so I suggest the following steps. When you have a piece of evidence, circle the important nouns or the most important parts of that evidence. And we'll take a look at some examples of this. Begin asking analysis and evaluation questions. So, what does it mean? Why is it important? How does it connect to this larger subject? Okay. I recommend free writing based on those questions. That way you can kind of get an idea of what you would write. And then taking that free writing and formalizing that into more draft style writing and eventually final paper writing. So circle the important nouns or most important parts overall. Begin asking what does it mean, why is it important, how does it connect. Free write based on those questions and then formalize it to the draft. So, and like I mentioned in the beginning, your paragraph should only be about 1/2 of a double space page. Okay, so if you're getting well beyond that, that means you have too much of one of these steps. If you're really short, it means you don't have enough of one of these steps. Okay, so that's what I want to see in your drafts, is you following this. And this is how it would look in a paragraph, except it would be double spaced. You have your introduction sentence that doesn't need to be cited, a general statement about what's in the paper. You have your evidence with a quote and a citation and a phrase from you leading into it. Then you have your analysis, breaking it down, your evaluation, the bigger picture, and connecting back to the thesis. Throughout your writing, we'll talk more about this, but avoid phrases like "in my opinion," "I think," "I believe," as it weakens what's called your ethos. We'll talk about that more, but your credibility. Okay. Now, let's look at how a student would go from their outline to paragraph format. Okay. So this is a student who wrote about the labor policies of Coca-Cola in India. And she came to me with this idea, and so I asked what her tentative or working thesis was. And she said the labor policies of Coca-Cola in India are barbaric in comparison to their policies in the United States. Both Indians and Americans should use every possible measure to force Coca-Cola to be a more socially responsible company. Okay, so that's her working thesis. Her subtopics, and so I asked, say you're presenting this as a court case to your to the jury. How could you divide it into 3 sections to present your case? She says subtopic 1, Coca-Cola is polluting groundwater. And then she has 2 other subtopics we'll get to. Okay. So I asked, well, what evidence? First, general idea. What general ideas? And we're looking at contrast. And she says, Coca-Cola has been taking groundwater from areas that desperately need the water to survive throughout India. And then in contrast to the U.S. has much stronger regulations regarding the use of groundwater. Okay, so then I said, okay, now you got to go get me evidence. You need to prove this, right? So she finds this information from her sources. In this case, it's a paraphrase. In 2006, Coca-Cola opened a factory in Kerala, India. The company has since been taking the groundwater from under the feet of villagers who are landless laborers. The only water these villagers have access to is water that is used to cremate people that die in their village. Okay. So I say first, highlight the important parts or nouns. And by the way, sorry, this is a depressing topic. It's just one that worked well to be able to use as an example. I think it stays with people too. So she chose that Coke is taking the groundwater, that the people are landless laborers, and that the water that is used is, or they have to use cremated water for drinking, washing, etc. And then I asked her to say, why are those parts important? Break it down and explain it to the reader. So first, the taking the groundwater. Why is that important? You could say, without groundwater, it would be extremely hard to be a farmer and to water your crops. You could say it'd be hard to do things like bathing and washing clothes. You could say it'd be hard to find enough water to drink or stay hydrated. Okay, so that would be analysis. That would be explaining why taking the groundwater is important. Why is it important that they're landless laborers? What do you think? Who are landless laborers? If you don't have land and you're someone who labors, you don't have much power, right? And so you could analyze that part of this evidence by saying landless laborers lack power and wealth, and therefore you could state something like they don't have the power to fight back against this large corporation, that they're powerless to stop or change what's happening, right? So that would be analyzing landless laborers. Then using water that is used to cremate people, you could analyze that by saying just that it might make you sick, right? That it might go against your religious or personal beliefs to drink that water. And just in general, the difficulties you might have from using that type of water. Explain that to your reader. Explain how it connects to this bigger idea of Coke taking groundwater. Okay. She then got me another piece of evidence. So for each of your subtopics, you need to have multiple pieces of evidence. Again, remember, if you're having a court case, the more evidence you have, the stronger your case. You should never have just one piece of evidence under a subtopic. Okay? So in this section, she comes up with, in the Kala Dera section of Rajasthan, there, where there's also a Coke factory, groundwater levels have been documented dropping at an alarming rate and having high levels of contamination. Okay, so you can see the part she emphasized there. She said dropping at alarming rates important and high levels of contamination. And so then you have to explain to your reader, why is that important? What's it mean? What's the bigger picture, and how does it connect to the overall thesis or subject? So if it's dropping at an alarming rate, you could say, this is getting worse. It's urgent that this is dealt with now, that Coke needs to be stopped, you know. And you need to declare that in a declarative way as you become more formal in writing this in your paper, right? And then the fact that it's contaminated, you could say, imagine having to drink or bathe in contaminated water. It could give you diseases or cancer, or could you could have problems concentrating or things of that nature. Explain to your reader why that's important. What's it mean? How it connects to the bigger picture, and how does it connect to the overall study? She comes up with a third piece of evidence. In another section of India, located close to a Coke factory, Villagers reported bouts of dizziness, and some developed rashes after bathing in the undoubtedly contaminated water. So she highlights dizziness, rashes, and contamination again. Need to ask, why is it important? What does it mean? What's the bigger picture? How does it connect to the overall study? So she starts asking questions like, why is groundwater important? Why is it important? Or I'm sorry, these are for the overall, all three pieces of evidence. So in this case, you could say, well, if you're dizzy, how can you work? How can you learn? How can you do almost anything if you're dizzy? If you have rashes, how uncomfortable that could be and how it could lead to infection, right? Explain that to your reader. Make it more powerful. Explain the case to that jury of why this is important. And then contamination, we already talked about, explaining that to the reader. Okay, so then I had her free write based on that analysis and evaluation. And she wrote, water, as we're well aware, is one of the most basic human necessities. Without water, the body will cease to function in an alarmingly short amount of time. But when faced with the choice between contaminated water and no water at all, how does one make such a choice? Both options result in equally horrific possible deaths. Moreover, what right does Coca-Cola have to force this choice upon the people of the villages? Okay, so as you can see, all those sentences do not come from sources. Instead, they come from analysis and evaluation. More evaluation in this part. The analysis is what we kind of walk through verbally. And if she just put this paragraph in her paper, there'd be a lot of problems, like who's the we in the beginning of the paragraph. The questions at the end of the paragraph might, I would encourage her to change to declarative statements. But this is free writing. And then I'd say, okay, great. Now formalize that. Make the language a little more official and condensed in the paper. Okay. So then on her, on the other side, when she's looking at the U.S., she said the United States has stronger regulations that prevent this. Coke has generally followed the laws in the United States. There have been instances where Coke has been fined in the United States, which prevents further abuse, right? So then she has to do the analysis, break it down. Why is it important? What's it mean? Etc. How does it, and then evaluation. What's the bigger picture? How does it connect to the overall study? Etc. Again, here's the paragraph structure. Sentence 1 or the first part should be introduction to the idea being discussed, but not evidence that needs to be cited. Sentence 2, the evidence with an introduction clause or phrase from you and a citation. You need to analyze that evidence, break it down. What does it mean? Why is it important? And then evaluate that evidence. How does this connect to the larger subject? And finally, connect back to your thesis called maintaining your argument. Okay, so let's look at one more, and we'll go over this one quicker. You could read this slower and more carefully on your own if you like. But she then said that this taking the groundwater affects their farming or their livelihood. So on the Indian side, she said this contamination does more than just pollute the drinking water. Farming is the way in which these villagers make their living. It's their work, their livelihood. They contaminated groundwater is in turn contaminating the soil, right? So that's her argument. That's her general statement on this. And you could break it down in different ways. On the U.S. side, farmers in the U.S. are protected through many different laws. This prevents corporations like Coke from stealing the groundwater. And I said, okay, all that's great. Now go find me evidence. So she finds some evidence here that I'm just to save a little time here, I'm just going to read the parts she circled as the most important. that Koch was distributing their solid waste products to local farmers under the guise of fertilizer. Then a study from the BBC found that it contains cadmium and lead, thus making them literal toxic waste products. Okay, so if I ask you why are those parts in bold important? Imagine again this is a court case and we're trying to prove our case. Well, that first section that's highlighted or bold, what does that prove? That proves motive, right? They know what they're doing. They're doing it purposely. They're purposely giving out this poison, this toxic waste to farmers to use as fertilizer. So explain how that proves motive in this case. That it contains cadmium and lead and they're literally toxic waste. Well, you could talk about how what lead does to the body. It actually causes brain damage, irreversible brain damage. So the exposure to these farmers could really impact their health tremendously, right? So analyze it. What does it mean? Why is it important? Okay, so now I want to mention here that once you've established some evidence like this from an academic journal, so this is from an academic journal, if you have a more medium, say one of your two sources that wasn't from an academic journal, once you've established this fact, if you want to give some color or kind of just add to that fact, it could be a more medium level of trust. And so we've established that Koch's doing this. So now a farmer says, my crops and my cattle are my only wealth, right? I'm nothing without them. To survive, they need water, and water is running out, right? You could not present this medium level personal testimonial on its own. But if you pair it with evidence that is highest level of trust, then it works. Again, what's it mean that the cattle and crops are their only wealth, especially when it's being poisoned? And what's it mean that water's running out? It means you have to act quickly, right? So you need to explain that to your reader. You've read 10, 12, 14 articles. You should be able to, things that your reader doesn't know. So you should be able to explain context and the importance of it to them, okay? Why is the guise of fertilizer important? Why are these things all important? Explain that to the reader. Then explain how it connects to the bigger subject and thesis. Free write about it first, right? So this is her free write. There's really no way to make good choices in this situation. Coca-Cola Corporation is destroying the way in which people in these communities make their money and support their families. Farming is the only access to earning a living that they have. They can't go out and get a job at the nearest Walmart as many people in America can. Their income is dependent upon the seeds they put in the ground and what becomes of those seeds. Coca-Cola is destroying the livelihood of these farmers in multiple ways. Not only are they eliminating precious groundwater, they're contaminating what water is left. Again, if she just took that and put it in her paper, it would be too informal, right? Instead, she needs to take that free write and make it more formal for her paper, okay? But that's a good start. Okay, so I'm going to start to wrap up now, and but what I want to say here is I recommend looking on the next page for sorry, my kids are being a little loud. One second. Okay, so on the next page are student samples from their papers. Okay, you can read through those, but what I'll do is I'll record the next video right away, and we'll go through these student samples, and I'll put it for next week's work. But I recommend, if you have the time, to go ahead and watch that video from next week. It'll be going over the student samples of analysis and evaluation, because I think for writing your draft, it would be really good to see how this looks in students' work. So I recommend either reading through those or going ahead to the video from next week or both. Okay, thanks guys.